Memoirs from Somebody Who Is Lost. Maisie Cortland sat on the floor next to her perfectly made blue-gray bed, which was tucked away in the corner of her impressively immaculate mid-sized room. Her eyes, whose color coordinated with her comforters, analyzed every inch of her room while she patiently awaited to hear the family van pull out of the driveway into the obsidian night. Instead, a knock came to her door, the gentle rapping of her mother's wedding ring humbly entreating entrance. The door was already ajar, so she nodded for her to come in. Her mother was a slightly built woman with soft, analytical, amber eyes that rang out a motherly worry whenever they met her daughters. Maisie had always been on the shy side, but she became impossible to speak with in the years after her little brother, Tyler, passed away from an accidental overdose. He was only 6 years old, and he got into Maisie's depression medicines and had a seizure. Maisie was the one who found him, only 2 years older at the time. By then, Tyler was already gone. 7 years of therapy had done nearly nothing for her severe depression and PTSD, and the problem seemed chronic. This last week, Maisie had hardly come out of her room. Maisie's brother's birthday would have been today, so her mother and father were going out to visit his grave and bring him flowers. She didn't want to come this year, and intended to spend the day meticulously cleaning her room instead. Maisie, honey, are you sure you don't want to come with us? I'm sure Tyler would have. He liked the blue flowers, okay? Make sure you get lots of blue ones for him, she interjected, half smiling. Maisie's mom approached skittishly, initiating a tearful hug with her daughter. This was the first time Maisie had smiled in years. Okay, baby, we'll get him some blue. Stay in the house, lock the doors, and... Oh, your dad left some hamburgers downstairs if you get hungry. We won't be gone long, okay? Keep your phone on you in case we text. She rambled. Maisie nodded. Maisie. Her mom stopped and looked her in the eyes, in her beautiful, overcast sky eyes that were brewing a rainstorm. I love you. I love you too, Mom. Her mother smiled at her and brushed the long brown hair from her forehead back, leaving the door open and departing to the van. For a while, Maisie just waited in her room with the lights on, sitting in between the end corner of the bed and the green walls. She closed her eyes and focused on the sensation of the freshly vacuumed, dingy-colored carpets underneath her toes. The van finally pulled out of the driveway, the headlights momentarily flashing into her room before turning into the street. As soon as the headlights faded, Maisie wandered into the kitchen and grabbed the fanciest glass she could find. She filled it up with her mother's favorite wine from on the top shelf of the pantry and grabbed her depression medicine bottles from the countertop. Take 2 tablets by mouth daily, it read. Maisie headed to her bathroom, putting everything on the sink counter. Next, she changed into her very finest dress and shoes. With a decisive gulp, she shoveled a handful of her pills into her mouth and took a swig of wine. It burned and hurt her throat, and she threw up into the sink. Oh, no. Maisie gathered up the pills and tried again, this time managing to scarf them down. Her sink was dirty now, so she went back to the kitchen to grab a sponge to clean it up. When she returned and cleaned up her sink, she began putting on makeup and curling her hair. In between activities, she would take a few more pills and pour a little more wine for herself. Eventually, the bottle that once contained around 40 pills was empty, and the bottle of wine was about a third of the way full. Maisie filled the bathtub and got in the water, still fully clothed. Suddenly, she could feel her lungs compress and expel air, and everything became obscured around the edges. She laughed, tears flowing out of her eyes like streams off of a mountain. Maisie was so happy to be lost in herself for the last time. The tears coming out of her eyes started bothering her, so much that she tore into them until she could finally see the hollowness that had been around her all along. Her eyes began to bleed hateful things into the water around her, and she looked at her bloody red fingernails through her scratchy, mottled vision. Maisie's pupils were huge, and her senses were so amplified that it hurt to move. The water turned brown around her body, enveloping her in a frothy black foam. Maisie's body was covered in filth, itching her so badly that she wanted to shed her skin to become clean again. No matter how hard she tried, though, she couldn't move anymore, and her head slid under the murky, tar water. Under the surface, she could breathe a lot better. Her eyes bled out a shadowy figure into the water, and it grabbed her hand to pull her deeper. The body of water was an ocean, and the further down they went, bluer and clearer it got. Suddenly, she let out a deep breath of surface air, and the bubbles from her mouth shot through the shadowy figure. Blindly, Maisie felt around for a solid surface to tether to. Overwhelming oceanic currents swept her to land, a cave of cracked obsidian, with walls polished like little mirrors. Although she could only see in patches, she could sense something near her. She saw the shadow again and reached out to grab its hand. It felt warm, safe, and familiar, like holding her dad's hand as a little girl. Maisie coughed out some blood and created a cloud of spiders that crawled all over everything, trailing glowing webs. The shadow figure pointed a very vague hand towards the mirrors, and Maisie saw herself sitting, her hair floating upwards and being nibbled on by little dark shadowfish. How beautiful, how strange. Suddenly, she felt her body tremble and heard the water slosh around. Maisie remembered that she was not meant to be breathing anymore, and that she should stop. How could she, though, when this world she made was so dark and gorgeous? It became harder to breathe as time went on, as she swam deeper into the obsidian cave, teetering on the sharp edges of permanence. Somehow, the shadow figure became more prominent as she ventured into the darkest layers. It disappeared quickly, right before Maisie realized she was falling, or being pulled down somehow, very rapidly and heavily. It felt like her spine was going to break, or that her skull might shatter from the pressure. Yet she remained intact until she hit the bottom, which was a huge reflective surface of pure white. It was the brightest thing she had seen in a while, a blinding contrast from the desperately lacking realm of black she just came from. Her shoulder was ripped out of the socket from the pressure, and the back of her head was bleeding and punctured from the shards where she shattered the mirror. It took a while for Maisie to get up, but eventually she managed to do so. She limped around the white world, which was so dry and cold that she could see her breath. Her feet sloshed around in her shoes, as she was soaking wet from swimming in the obsidian cave. This place was so bright that she could hardly see in front of her. Maisie saw something move next to her, her reflection. Horrifically mauled and distorted, Maisie hardly recognized herself. The reflection's mouth moved, but no sound came out. It waved its finger to beckon her closer. Maisie braced herself with both hands flat on the mirror and put her ear up to the glass. Now she could hear her. We have a reason when we're alone. The reflection pulled her through the solid surface into the mirror world and disappeared. Maisie screamed bloody murder, bawling the entire time. It felt like her body was being strung through a field of hot glass shards, inside and out. Every inch of her being hurt so badly that when she finally got to the other side, all she could do was vomit up blood and pieces of glass. Forgetting about her dislocated right shoulder, she tried to lean on it and collapsed onto her right side. Maisie's body convulsed in agony, and she coughed up frothy pink foam onto her chin, throat, and chest. As soon as she stopped shaking, she stood up and tried to find a way out. Part of her wanted to go home and lay in her nicely made bed. I have nice, and it's blue, Maisie whispered incoherently, sounding far away. Her reflection's eyes were all black, and it was sitting in her bathtub, which was overflowing onto the floor now. Maisie saw her parents rush in, her father calling the police while her mother frantically tried to pull it out of the water. No, that's not me, Mom. It's okay, she tried to say. Her reflection tried to repeat after her, but it said something else that made far less sense. Mom, is the all good okay? Maisie, that doesn't make sense. That doesn't make any sense. What are you talking about? Maisie's reflection chuckled and screamed. It wouldn't stop screaming. Maisie herself grew angry with it. She tried to walk towards it, but there was some invisible barrier between her and that world. Maisie started crying, and her eyebrows furrowed deeply. The reflection looked over to her and laughed harder, and Maisie began screaming over and over. I want to go home. Mom, Dad, Tyler, Dad, Mom, I want to go home. That's not me. She broke down and started punching at the barrier. It was incredibly hard and would not fracture, so all she was doing was breaking her knuckles. The bone in her wrist snapped off, and she howled in agonizing pain. That last shriek caused the whole place to rumble. Maisie saw the shadow figure in the reflection behind her, but it disappeared behind a corner. Abandoning her reflection, she chased after it around a maze of bright white mirrors. This place was like a house of mirrors at a circus, and she was hopelessly lost. Maisie banged her head against one of the mirrors directly in front of her, and the puddle of blood that dropped on the floor morphed into a delicate butterfly. Its intricate patterns carved into thin flakes of dried blood made her unfathomably angry, so she crushed it in her palm. When she opened it, she realized her hand was sliced up, and the butterfly seemed to be perfectly intact. What a futile effort. It landed on the ground, and so she stomped on it with her shoe, ignoring the searing pain of her hand. The impact from her shoe on the ground broke a hole, and she was falling again. Maisie was being pulled back into the darkness again, into the obsidian cavern. Her eyes hurt, and she could feel blood dribble out of them onto her chin. She scratched up her face with her nails, screaming and growling at the empty mirrors that reflected everything but her. Here it was, the shadow creature that led her into this void world. The creature opened his scintillating mouth and spoke in a deep voice that sounded like steel. "You are unsalvageable. You will perish." The empty world began to crumble, the obsidian crashing down and shattering into pieces like glass. Maisie laughed maniacally and cracked a frenzied grin. She was simply content to watch her conscious mind shatter around her in shrouded black mirrors, hoping they would never paint her wretched picture again. A large shard bit through her skull from above, and she began to bleed profusely from her head. Her eyes closed. Maisie opened her mouth and blood spilled out, floating up into the water that was glacially growing murkier. Soon the blackness obscured what was left of her vision, and her stomach began to consume itself. It simmered and burned, churning within her. Maisie's lungs began to refuse the water around her finally, and each breath became thicker and thicker until she was completely inundated with water. Maisie's life flickered in and out, fluttering like the wings of the bloody butterflies flying out of her mouth. They all swarmed the cave and flew out from the wreckage. Maisie was trapped in the collapsing reality her crippled consciousness had created. The thought of losing her life no longer daunted her, and she became unafraid of what might come to fruition. The shadow creature crept over her like a wave on a beach, deftly dodging all the falling debris to overtake Maisie's emaciated form. It rolled over her like a dark fog and swept her up into its formless arms, carrying her dripping, bloodied body into the light above them. By this time, Maisie could only see vague shapes and colors, but she knew that she had already lost. For one last time, she opened her mouth as it contorted into a broken, painless smile. Maisie Cortland was lost, and she was elated.